Chapter 36. Eiji knew he was supposed to sleep. That was the whole reason his master had left. He wanted Eiji to relax and rest, which he had accomplished by foregoing any rest of his own. But it was impossible. How could Eiji possibly sleep after all he'd heard? His mind kept turning over everything Lord Felix had said. He couldn't even make lists. What would they be lists of? Reasons why he was a spoiled, ungrateful fuck? All the things Lord Felix had said about him, arranged in order of how little he deserved each kind word? For the second night in a row, he tossed and stewed in his misery, finally stumbling from his bed to lurch out to the kitchens and work his shift. "Oh, fuck!" Norio gasped as soon as Eiji dragged himself through the door. "What happened to you?" Yesterday, Eiji had explained to Norio and Rokuro both that he'd upset Lord Felix. He hadn't shared any details beyond that, no matter how Norio pressed and wheedled. They'd been sympathetic, though clearly they didn't realize the extent of his shame. Norio must have been expecting Eiji to look better today, and those expectations were obviously not being met. He stood on his toes and pressed a hand to Eiji's forehead, checking for fever. "I'm not sick, Norio." Eiji didn't even have the energy to be offended. "Lord Antony came to visit my master last night, and they fought." "They fought?" Norio's eyes lit with interest. "You mean with punching and kicking and shit?" "Of course not," huffed Eiji, trying to give Norio a quelling look. "It was just a disagreement. I don't know why I said fought. In fact, I don't know why I said anything at all. It's none of my business." Why was he spreading his lord's business over the ship? He shouldn't be gossiping like this. What if word got back to Lord Felix that his attendant was flapping his loose lips about things he overheard while eavesdropping on his betters? Eiji wasn't usually so careless. He would have to watch himself when he was tired like this. "Aw, come on, you can't do that to me," Norio whined. "What did they fight about?" Then, when Eiji glared at him, "Fine, what did they disagree about?" "Nothing." Eiji's head was beginning to hurt. "I shouldn't have said anything. Where's Rokuro?" It was a desperate ploy, but it worked. Norio's shoulders sagged, and he cast a longing look at the baker's usual station, clearly distracted. "He took a rest day," the man sighed. "He wanted to spend time with Hanzo." "Hanzo?" Eiji recognized the name, but his brain was too fogged with misery and sleeplessness to make any connections at the moment. Norio frowned distractedly at Rokuro's usual place. "He comes to game night, remember? He works in Lord Cloelia's fishery. Big beard, lots of muscles. I guess he's handsome, if you like the big, strong, manly type." Oh, Eiji remembered now. The man had been the first to scold him after he'd upset Lord Felix with that awful song. What a small, easily forgotten mistake that seemed like now. "They're from the same cadre," Norio went on, his narrow shoulders stiff as he hugged his elbows. "They were best friends back at the temple. I guess Hanzo used to work in the galley with Rokuro, but he kept ruining dishes until Zenji found him a new work detail. They didn't want to split up, though." Norio was quiet for a moment, then burst out, "I've only made a few mistakes, you know, and never anything that ruined a whole meal. I'll probably get to stay in the galley forever." Eiji was spared from trying to parse this non sequitur by the arrival of Yudai, who waved in their direction. "Let's get going," the quiet man urged when Eiji and Norio joined him next to the line of meal carts. "Eiji, are you delivering to the back quarter again today?" The back quarter included Lord Antony's rooms. Eiji opened his mouth to refuse or beg for mercy. He wasn't sure which, but Yudai had already shoved the cart at him and moved on. Edgy's hand shook on the cart handles as he traversed the ship. Every hallway seemed to stretch twice as long as usual, and at the same time he felt as if he were being swept towards the dreaded door on an unstoppable torrent. I could abandon the cart and run. No, Zenji would be so disappointed in him. I could find some way to sprain my ankle so someone else would have to do it. No, that would result in Lord Julia being summoned, and she would probably realize what he had done and tell his master. And even if she didn't, Edgy couldn't bear the thought of Lord Felix fussing over him the way he had done when he hurt his shoulder. Even less could he bear the thought that Lord Felix might not. I could run and find Norio and make him trade with me. That idea had merit, but even as he came up with it, Edgy realized that he'd arrived at his former master's door. It was too late to turn back. Edgy just needed to make this quick. He could just hand over the tray and be on his way. He lifted his hand and knocked, disgust flashing through him when he saw that his hand was trembling. Ridiculous! What was he afraid of? The boy, Hanyu, was in disgrace. There would be no hugging and dancing to startle Edgy this time. Everything would be fine. When the young man opened the door, however, he looked infuriatingly cheery and put together. There was no sign that he'd been weeping, and he moved easily. Had Lord Antony been serious? Had this snot-nosed little miscreant actually disobeyed and gotten away with it? Edgy forced himself to adopt a civil tone as he held out the tray. Good morning, Hanyu. I'm so glad to see you, the boy gushed, startling him a little with the intensity of his voice and his big brown eyes, which fixed on Edgy's face in open appeal. He looked ready to rush forward and seize Edgy's hands. I went looking for you yesterday to apologize. Yesterday, the day when Hanyu had gone off alone and sent his master running to Lord Felix for advice about how to handle it. He'd been looking for Edgy? To apologize? Apologize for what? Hanyu was still speaking. I was awful, and I'm so sorry. I didn't mean... What the hell are you talking about? Edgy wondered dazedly, just as an impatient voice snapped. Hanyu, stop that. Lord Antony's tone was as stern and commanding as ever. Edgy's pulse spiked in fright as the god came to stand in the doorway with them, but there was relief in his presence as well. Lord Antony had argued with Lord Felix, and now he was stopping Hanyu's flood of incomprehensible apologies. Lord Antony knew what Edgy deserved, and, more importantly, what he did not. Edgy began to kneel, but an impatient gesture stopped him. He was forced to stand, uncomfortably aware of how he towered over the diminutive god, as Lord Antony looked him over. What does he want from me? Does he have a message from my lord? Oh gods, what will Lord Felix think if I carry a message from Lord Antony after I called his name out when being used? Would he think that I went crawling after my old master and tried to throw myself at him? No, that's ridiculous. My lord knows I make meal deliveries. I'm acting unhinged. I imagine you heard some of what your master and I discussed yesterday, Lord Antony said at last. Fuck! Of course Lord Antony had realized that Edgy was eavesdropping, just as his own master had. Such presumption was inexcusable. Was he going to demand that Lord Felix punish his wayward attendant? Was that the message he wanted Edgy to carry? Forgive me, my lord, Edgy managed, doing his best to sound calm despite the fact that his bowels had turned to water inside of him. It was not my intention to eavesdrop. Stupid! Who cared about a slave's intentions? What mattered was that he had eavesdropped. He'd pried into the affairs of his betters and then gossiped about them with the other kitchen workers. The god huffed softly. You could hardly help it. Listen, I know you're busy right now, but come by when you have some time, will you? Felix was right, though I was in too much of a temper to see it. I'm the one who owes you an apology, not Hanyu. Panic flooded Eji's body, but not the way it usually did. He was simply too tired, and there had been too many stabs of icy fear over the last few days. His heart sped, and he felt sweat prickling under his robes, but all his mind could muster was a heavy, cloudy grayness. This cannot be happening. Take your food, boy, Lord Antony snapped, and Eiji was barely even aware the god had truly spoken until Hanyu reached forward to take the tray from his unresisting hands. Lord Antony began closing the door as soon as his offering stepped back, but he paused. I'm glad you're with Felix now. We'll see you later, all right? Eiji stood outside the door for a long time, but finally he turned back to his cart. Eiji? Eiji! Norio's pretty, fine-boned face was pinched with worry, and Eiji couldn't help jumping a little at the sight of him. Where had the other man come from? In fact, where had the kitchens come from? Eiji was standing just inside the galley door, Norio's hands covering his where they still rested on the handles of his cart. The cart was empty. Did that mean Eiji had made his deliveries, or that he had dumped all the trays in some corner? A deeper, sharper panic started brewing in his belly. Was he losing time again? It had happened a few times during his years with Lord Antony, when stormy weather kept him below decks for a week or more. He would find himself waking up without remembering when he'd gone to bed, or halfway through a chore he didn't remember starting. Why was this happening again? Was he losing his mind? What's wrong, you two? Eiji turned gratefully at the sound of Zenji's voice. Perhaps it was silly to believe that the older man, a human slave like himself, would be able to fix everything that had gone so wrong in Eji's life, but he couldn't help relaxing anyway. I'm sorry, Zenji. When was he going to stop doing that? Sorry, Norio. I haven't slept. They both squinted suspiciously at Eiji. Other kitchen workers were beginning to notice the commotion as well, stealing surreptitious glances and edging closer, clearly hoping to overhear something interesting. Rokuro tried to warn me about the way they hunt gossip around here. Did Lord Felix... Zenji darted a look at Norio, obviously wondering how much he knew of Eji's troubles. Did something happen? Mutely, Eiji shook his head. He couldn't bear to have the last few days' events turned into fodder for speculation. Lord Felix didn't deserve that. Well then, you need to get some rest, Zenji decreed, though he didn't look as though he believed Eji's denial. I won't have anybody poorly rested in here with all these stoves and knives. It isn't safe. But the rest of my shift, Eiji protested weakly, even though all he wanted was to go home. Strange. Even after 6 years with Lord Antony, Eiji had always pictured the temple when he thought of home. Now, though, he envisioned Lord Felix's rooms, the armchairs, the little room where his own bed was cocooned and private and safe. But Lord Felix would be coming back to the room, and who knew when? His shifts in the elder rooms were irregular now, thanks to Eiji. The god wouldn't be expecting his disgraced attendant back so soon, and might be displeased or inconvenienced by his presence. No, he couldn't possibly disrupt their long-standing schedule without his lord's prior knowledge and permission. Why don't you take a nap in my bed? Norio asked suddenly. That way you can join us for lunch if you wake up in time. It was just enough of a compromise to make Eiji feel a little bit needed, and he accepted it gratefully. With permission from Zenji, Norio led him off to the galley workers' living quarters. It's just a cot, the smaller man said apologetically. And it's out in the open. Zenji's working on figuring out a room for me, but until then... It'll be perfect, Eiji assured him. Thank you. Really, all he cared about was having a place to lay his head where no one would talk to him anymore. I guess back in the old days, when Zenji started working here, everybody slept out in the common area, Norio prattled on. But once he started running things, he thought everybody should have more privacy, especially if they were going to bring back lovers like he did with Bunta. Norio's face darkened. I guess we should be quiet when we go past Rokuro's door. Maybe he's busy in there. When they passed the plain door that Norio pointed out as Rokuro's, however, the room within seemed to be deserted. That didn't cheer Norio up at all. If anything, he looked even more depressed as he slumped past the door and guided Eiji to his little sleeping space. Sure enough, the cot looked small and exposed in the middle of the workers' living quarters. Still, Eiji was hardly bothered. He sat down heavily and waited for Norio to walk away so he could cry or scream into the pillow or sleep, whatever the moment required. Instead, Norio crouched down in front of Eiji, wringing his hands and peering anxiously into his face. "Eiji," he began hesitantly, stopped, then pressed on. "I know I'm nosy, and I haven't always been... I promise I'm only asking this because I care about you. I won't tell anyone a single word you say. Just, please, what's going on? I'm worried about you." Back at the temple, it had always seemed like Norio had hated Eiji. He had been quick to notice any hint of a flaw or weakness and merciless in his mockery. Eiji would never have dreamed that he would even consider bearing the worst failures of his life to Norio of all people. But when he looked into the man's eyes, there were fine lines around the edges that hadn't been there at the temple. They were hardly even wrinkles yet, just traces that showed where generous laugh lines would appear in the coming years. His eyes were soft, his brows furrowed in genuine concern. If Eiji had become less than what he was in their temple days, perhaps Norio had become more. "I fucked everything up," he found himself whispering. "I hurt Lord Felix. Really hurt him. He's revoked my courtship privileges." Norio gasped. There was no triumph or mischievous glee in his face, only care. Eiji found himself pouring out the whole horrible story. He even described his lord's argument with Lord Antony the previous night and his former master's intention to apologize to him. He stayed dry-eyed through the retelling, but as his rambling narrative drew to a close, he still felt some of the scraped-out peace that followed a good bout of crying. Norio just listened to the whole account. When it became clear that Eiji was done talking, he let out a low whistle. "What a mess," he observed, sounding a little awestruck. "I'm sorry, Eiji. I'd be a wreck if all that happened to me." The statement offered no solutions, but somehow Eiji felt as if it were exactly what he'd wanted to hear anyway. If only he deserved it. "I brought it all on myself," he exhaled, letting his shoulders droop. "You can't help it that Lord Antony wants to apologize," Norio argued. Eiji groaned. "But I'm not owed any apologies. Nothing Lord Antony did with me was wrong. I'm afraid my lord just picked a fight with him because he was upset about what I did. And that was definitely my fault. I can't believe I said the wrong name, Norio." "I said it was a mess." Norio held up his hands. "I'm not arguing with you about that. But, well, I know I'm outside the situation, and I won't be offended if you want to tell me to fuck off with my opinions, but I don't think Felix is going to break things off with you forever. He really, really likes you, Eiji. Anyone can see that." Maybe he did." It hurt to admit that, to acknowledge everything Eiji had thrown away. "But after what I did, if you could have just seen the way my lord looked, he was going to cry." This might not be helpful, but you made him cry before, and he was still absolutely gone for you, Norio said bluntly. That did not help. This was so much worse than that stupid song. Norio got to his feet. Like I said, I don't know anything. That's just what I think. And I should get back to work. But thank you for telling me, Eiji. He turned to go. Eiji just wanted to fall down on the mattress and sleep for a week, but something possessed him to call out after the smaller man. I don't think Rokuro likes Hanzo more than you, he said lamely. Norio didn't turn around, but something about the way his slender shoulders hunched up towards his ears made Eiji think he'd heard him nonetheless. After pouring his troubles out to Norio, Eiji felt somehow released from the need to sift through them as he lay down on the cot. They would all still be there when he woke. For the moment, he let himself tumble gratefully into oblivion.